more and more ways to link the frontline impacted community struggles to that broader interest, or vice versa. And then globally, we're seeing definitely a lot of steps forward and also steps back, right? So for a while, the WTO people said, well, it's not dead, but it's in the fridge. It's like kind of cool. And then it's kind of made a comeback, and I think people are trying to step up and say, how can we build enough power so that we can challenge that across sectors of movements, not only food, but working with folks who work around migration, working with folks who are talking more about climate justice, working with workers' rights. These are issues that are not new, but I think there's an increasing recognition of the need for different sectors of movements to work together. And through the World Social Forum process and other processes, we are seeing more of that movement building, but I think we have a lot more work to do. So, you want to pick up from there?
Yeah, there's several years ago, the Kellogg Foundation did a study. They asked the question, at what percent of the U.S. food economy could you consider, or food that is eaten by people in the U.S. could be considered basically healthy, not fair, not exploitative, somewhat sustainable and affordable. And in their research, they came up with the answer that it's about 2%, which means that the typical American, anyway, is eating meals that have a hidden cost one way or the other. So I use that as what you asked, where are we? So just in terms of, we're at and I don't think it's changed that much when what we see from universities that we understand. So we have a long way to go to change that. I think we're just in some ways at the beginning, but at a really promising place. One of the things that I think is promising when we talk about how do we bring the different sectors who have not, or even just different movements that have not even totally seen themselves as this part of the same movement together, is the fact that food chain workers are much more organized together and in relationship to the rest of the food movement than they were. And that's largely through their own effort to kind of yank the food movement and say, hey, we are a part of it too. And so I think that creates a whole other political possibility, because when 20 million workers, the largest segment of workers in the economy, are seen as and maybe begin to be part of this, we have a different kind of political possibility. And as Sarah mentioned, my organization and Union of Concerned Scientists and Food Chain Workers Alliance and Movement Strategy Center and others are working to try to create the coalition that can actually set an agenda and live up to the kind of food plan that you called for, Mark, and others. Like, how can we actually create that platform?
I don't want to be a downer, but there's a lot of room for industrial food to expand. I mean, we think of industrial food as dominant, and indeed in the United States it is. But in fact, food sovereignty is quite real around the world, as you've seen better than I have. But I think something like 70% of the world's food is still produced in traditional ways, using disproportionately small amounts of, I think the numbers are 70% of the world's food is produced using 30% of its resources, agricultural resources, and 30% of the world's food, industrial food, is produced using 70% of the. So really, when you look at it, there's a lot of room for industrial agriculture to grow.
Absolutely.
And there's a way in which that growth is better poised than the food movement is to make things happen. There's real reason to be hopeful, but there's also a real reason to be scared to death.
Absolutely.
And I raised this because of the Trans-Pacific Partnership in some part, and because my experience in the last few months, but especially in the last couple of weeks since the fast track legislation was introduced last week. And again, this is legislation that would allow President Obama to essentially force Congress to vote yes or no on what's called Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is ostensibly a trade agreement, but is really a license for international capital to move however it wants and move food and labor pretty much however it wants. I could go on, but this isn't about what I know. This is about what you know. Sorry. I find this really scary. Yeah. I find that many people, like my friends, who I think are pretty smart people, don't know anything about any of this. So what I think what we're seeing is a real, I think you can argue that there's a food movement, and I think you can argue that we've made a dent and that there's reason for industrial agriculture, the big food, to be nervous, but I see this kind of thing as a counterattack. Mm-hmm. So are we really prepared for this and what can happen? And maybe this isn't so much a food question as a political question, but we know that this is coming down to power and politics, as you've just said. So let's just tackle that for a few minutes, and then we'll hopefully get questions from people in the audience.
I'm terrified too, sure. I think, and to be clear, because WTO, NAFTA, trade deals are so like arcane and hard to understand. And this one is secret, not by, most of us don't know about it, not by accident partly, but partly because it's being conducted in secret. So we're not necessarily meant to know about it. It's scary from this point of view because it creates a court. One of the ways it operates is creates a special court in which a company or a country can sue another company, sue another country for something that impedes its profits. And so if you are a city that passes an ordinance that says you want to actually purchase 20% of your food from around the area, that could be eligible for legal action under this, or organic labeling, or fair trade labeling, or all sorts of ways that we direct ourselves. So
or
it's
a soda tax.
Or a soda tax. Mexico was sued by Cargill for having a a tax on high fructose corn syrup. So it's a direct threat to what we're trying to do. But to your question, one thing that gives me hope is that these have been stopped before, and that's why we spent all last week rallying students. Got 100 students on a webinar. Made phone calls on Friday. You can still do this. Citizens Trade Campaign, by the way, is a place to go. You can easily make calls to your representatives. So in some ways, I'm using this to say, like, not to theorize, but say, like, we have to get busy right now and stop this. And we can do it. And if we do it, well, I'll stop there.
Agreed.
Anything?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I share the terrifying feeling, because I think what you brought up is absolutely true, that there's huge threats to the way that communities around the world have been producing food in ways that are much healthier. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think, is one really important example of that. What we were talking about before when I brought up the green revolution, but also climate smart agriculture. We're seeing a lot of focus on Africa right now. There's this thing called the G8 New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. It's another way that governments that are kind of the rich and powerful governments are trying to pressure the governments of the global south to create what they call an enabling business environment. It sounds familiar. It's what free trade is trying to do as well, but this is one more mechanism. So they're creating country agreements with individual nations in Africa, and they're trying to get places that have passed really progressive legislation, such as legislation around protecting the seeds, and preventing GMOs or protecting farmers' rights to share seeds. They're trying to get rid of that legislation to make way for corporations to come in and take over. Or land grabs. We're seeing more and more pushes for what they call foreign investment in land, but really what they're talking about is taking that land away from the local communities. And also changing protections on trade. So, they're being very bold about it, and we're seeing that the impacts on communities on the ground are really severe. So there's reason to be terrified. And at the same time, I think when I hear folks from Via Campesina say, globalize the struggle, globalize hope, it's not empty. So in Mexico, there was actually a success in stopping the commercial planting of GMO corn because of social movements who fought for over a decade to do that. It's not a permanent win. There's still going to be continued struggles. But, that's where corn is from. It's so important to local communities. And that's a win that a lot of people thought wouldn't be possible. In Guatemala as well, peasant movements were able to defeat what's called a Monsanto law, which is another law that was trying to promote privatization of seeds. So I think, is it at the level where it needs to be? Are we on par in terms of power with the corporate interests that are trying to take over? Not yet, and so that is scary. But when you think about the scale, wow, 250 million families. Each family has, probably 4 or 5 people. That's probably at least 1 billion people in one international network. And imagine all the other people who aren't in that one but are, engaged in other ways. So that's what makes me feel like, okay, we're gonna be experiencing more and more difficult situations. We probably can't even imagine.